The rain drummed relentlessly against the windows of the cozy suburban home in Littlewood, Ohio, a small town where life moved at a slow, familiar pace. Inside, Janelle Rivers was flipping pancakes in the kitchen, her warm smile lighting up the room as the rich scent of syrup and butter wafted through the air. 7-year-old twins, Logan and Dylan, sat at the breakfast table, engaged in their usual morning squabbles. "Mom, Dylan's hogging the syrup again." Logan's voice rang out, his little hand stretching across the table in a futile attempt to snatch the bottle from his brother. "Am not," Dylan replied, clutching the syrup bottle as if it were treasure. Janelle glanced over her shoulder with a knowing look, her brown eyes crinkling with a blend of amusement and patience. "Boys, there's plenty to go around," she said, setting down a fresh plate of pancakes. The twins quickly forgot their argument, their chatter replaced by the sound of forks scraping plates as they dug in. Meanwhile, in the garage, David Rivers stood admiring his prized project, a vintage Chevrolet Impala he'd been restoring for months. The morning sunlight streaming through the dusty garage windows highlighted the car's gleaming chrome. Logan and Dylan appeared at the doorway, their faces lit with curiosity. "Dad, can we start it up?" Logan asked eagerly, his nose nearly pressed against the driver's side window. David laughed, wiping his hands on an old rag. "All right, but only if you promise me something. You never, ever do this without an adult. Got it?" The twins nodded solemnly, their wide eyes filled with excitement. David opened the door and motioned them closer. "First, you check the gear. It has to be in park. Then, you turn the key. Like this." The engine roared to life, making Dylan jump and Logan beam. "Can we try?" Logan asked, practically bouncing in place. David helped each boy onto his lap, letting them grip the steering wheel and feel the vibrations of the powerful engine. "Remember," he said, his tone suddenly serious, "this is just for fun. No driving without an adult, ever." Janelle appeared in the doorway, her hands on her hips, a playful smile on her lips. "Teaching them bad habits already?" "They're smart enough to know better," David assured her, winking. "Just some bonding time before work." Several weeks later, a storm descended on Littlewood, the kind that made the skies darken in the middle of the day. Janelle sat on the living room couch, a mug of tea in hand, while Logan and Dylan sprawled on the floor engrossed in their drawings. The sound of thunder rumbled in the distance, making Dylan glance nervously toward the window. "It's just a little storm," Janelle reassured him with a soft smile. But as the storm intensified, the wind howled and rain pelted the windows with an almost menacing force. Suddenly, a coughing fit overtook Janelle. It started softly but quickly grew harsh and uncontrollable. She tried to wave it off, but both boys looked up, their concern mounting. "You okay, Mom?" Logan asked, his voice small. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice was hoarse. "Let's grab some flashlights just in case." She stood, but another coughing fit racked her body, forcing her to grip the counter for support. The storm raged on as the power flickered and then went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the worried faces of Logan and Dylan. "Mom?" Dylan called out, his voice trembling. Janelle's response was cut off by a gasp for air. She swayed on her feet before collapsing to the floor, her hand clutching her chest. The sound of shattering glass followed as she knocked over a cup in her fall. "Mom!" Logan cried, rushing to her side as Dylan hovered in the doorway, frozen in fear. "Call 911!" Logan shouted. Dylan ran to grab the phone, but the line was dead. They tried Janelle's cell phone, but the signal was gone too. Panic filled the room as Logan looked at his mother's pale, sweat-drenched face. Her breathing was shallow and labored. "We need to get help," Logan said, his voice shaking but resolute. He glanced at his brother. "Help me get her to the car." "But Dad said," Dylan began, his voice trembling. "We don't have a choice," Logan snapped, his fear boiling over. "She needs a hospital now." The twins struggled to move their mother, their small hands gripping the edges of a blanket as they dragged her toward the garage. Rain blew in sideways as Logan pushed open the garage door, his heart pounding with a mix of terror and determination. The old Impala sat waiting like a silent sentinel, its polished exterior glinting faintly in the storm's dim light. "Are you sure about this?" Dylan asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We have to try," Logan said, opening the driver's side door. He climbed in, his small frame barely reaching the pedals. "Help me get her in the back seat." Together, they heaved Janelle into the car, her unconscious body slumping against the seat. Logan took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. "Dad said park first, then key," he muttered, turning the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the boys flinched. Rain lashed against the windshield as Logan shifted into reverse, the car jerking backward out of the garage. The tires skidded slightly on the slick driveway before finding traction. Logan's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting between the rain-soaked road and the rearview mirror, where he could see Janelle's pale face. "We'll get there," he whispered, more to himself than to Dylan. Dylan clung to the passenger door, his wide eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Do you even know the way?" "I think so," Logan replied, his voice wavering. "Just tell me if I'm doing something wrong." The storm made familiar streets look foreign, the sheets of rain turning every corner into a potential hazard. Logan's heart raced as he tried to remember the route to Littlewood General Hospital, a place he'd only been to once when Dylan broke his arm last summer. The boys' desperate journey through the storm continued, each minute stretching into an eternity. Logan's small hands clung to the wheel, his jaw clenched in concentration, as the Impala swerved through the rain-slicked streets. The wipers thrashed back and forth, but the torrent of rain made it nearly impossible to see. Beside him, Dylan sat rigid, his fingers digging into the seat as he alternated between watching the road and glancing nervously at their mother. "She's getting worse," Dylan whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. He turned in his seat, his heart sinking as he saw Janelle's chest rising and falling in uneven, shallow gasps. "Don't say that," Logan snapped, his voice shaking with fear and frustration. "We're going to get there. We have to." Ahead, the dim outline of a stoplight came into view, its red glow barely cutting through the sheets of rain. Logan squinted, trying to gauge the distance, when suddenly a bright beam of light sliced across the Impala's windshield. The wail of a police siren followed, piercing through the roar of the storm. Dylan's head whipped around, his eyes wide with panic. "It's the cops!" he cried, sinking lower into his seat. Logan's heart plummeted. The red and blue lights reflecting in the rearview mirror made his stomach churn. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Pull over, I think," Dylan replied, though his voice was full of uncertainty. "That's what Dad always does." Logan hesitated, his mind racing. Would they be arrested? Would the officer take Mom away? But as the cruiser's sirens blared louder, he knew they had no choice. His hands shaking, Logan guided the car toward the curb, the tires skidding slightly before coming to a jerky stop. Officer Mark Hayes stepped out of his cruiser, pulling his raincoat tighter against the relentless downpour. The dark sedan he'd pulled over had been weaving dangerously across the road, and with the storm making visibility nearly impossible, he feared the worst, a drunk driver or an accident waiting to happen. As he approached the car, Hayes's flashlight cut through the rain, illuminating the rain-streaked windows. What he saw inside stopped him in his tracks. Two children, boys no older than 7 or 8, sat frozen in the front seats, their faces pale and tear-streaked. The driver's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and the passenger looked ready to burst into tears. "Dear God," Hayes muttered under his breath, lowering his flashlight slightly. He stepped closer, shining the beam into the back seat. There, he saw a woman slumped over, her chest rising and falling in uneven, labored breaths. "Driver, roll down the window," Hayes called out, his voice firm but laced with urgency. Logan fumbled with the controls, finally managing to lower the window. Rain blew into the car, mixing with his tears as he looked up at the officer. Please help us," he choked out, his voice cracking. "What's going on here?" Hayes demanded, though the worry in his voice was clear. "Is that your mother in the back seat?" Logan nodded frantically, the words tumbling out in a rush. She collapsed, and we couldn't call anyone, and we didn't know what to do, so we... Hayes held up a hand, cutting him off. Okay. Slow down, kid. Take a deep breath. He crouched slightly to meet Logan's tear-filled gaze. You're saying she's unconscious? Yes, Dylan piped up from the passenger seat, his voice shaking. We tried to call 911, but the phones weren't working, and there was no one home, and... All right, Hayes interrupted, straightening up. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. The storm was slowing emergency response times, and waiting for an ambulance could mean the difference between life and death for the woman in the back seat. He clicked his radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Hayes. I've got a medical emergency on Pine and Willow. Female, early 30s, unconscious, and unresponsive. 2 minors present, requesting backup and ambulance, but I'm preparing to transport to Memorial Hospital myself. Clear all routes. Hayes moved quickly, opening the driver's door and gesturing for Logan to climb out. Kid, I'm taking over now. You and your brother get in the back seat and stay with your mom. Logan hesitated, his small frame shaking as he slid out of the driver's seat. Are you sure you can help her? He asked, his voice breaking. Hayes placed a hand on Logan's shoulder, his gaze steady. I promise. You did everything right. Now let me take it from here. Logan nodded, his lower lip trembling as he climbed into the back seat beside Dylan. The twins huddled together, their hands clutching their mothers as Hayes slid behind the wheel. The Impala roared to life, and Hayes flipped on the cruiser's emergency lights, the red and blue glow cutting through the storm as they sped toward the hospital. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, every ounce of his focus on the slick, winding streets ahead. Dispatch, I need constant updates on road conditions, Hayes barked into his radio. This storm is making visibility near zero. In the back seat, Dylan leaned his head against Logan's shoulder, his quiet sobs barely audible over the sound of the rain. Logan stared at their mother's face, willing her to wake up. We're almost there, Mom, he whispered. Please hang on. The hospital's emergency entrance came into view, its bright lights a beacon in the storm. Hayes pulled up to the curb, the Impala skidding slightly as he braked. Medical staff rushed out with a gurney, their faces grim as they took in the scene. She's unresponsive, Hayes explained as they worked quickly to lift Janelle from the car. Breathing is shallow. Kids said she collapsed during the storm. Logan and Dylan scrambled out of the back seat, their small hands clutching at the gurney as the medics wheeled their mother inside. A nurse gently but firmly guided them away, kneeling down to their level. You're both so brave, she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. We're going to take care of your mom now, okay? Logan nodded, his lip trembling. Will she be all right? The nurse hesitated, then gave him a reassuring smile. We'll do everything we can. Hours later, the storm had begun to ease, its fury replaced by a gentle drizzle. Logan and Dylan sat side by side in the hospital waiting room, their small hands clasped together tightly. Hayes sat nearby, watching over them like a silent guardian. Finally, a doctor emerged, his face tired but kind. She's stable, he said, and the boys' faces lit up with relief. You got her here just in time. Logan let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down his cheeks. Dylan buried his face in his brother's shoulder, his small body racked with sobs. Hayes felt a lump in his throat as he watched the boys cling to each other. You two are real heroes, Hayes said softly, kneeling beside them. What you did tonight took courage. Don't ever forget that. The boys looked up at him, their tear-streaked faces filled with gratitude. For the first time that night, Logan managed a small, hopeful smile. Thank you, he whispered. As the rain continued to fall outside, the twins knew that no matter how dark the storm, they had weathered it together and come out stronger on the other side. As dawn broke over Littlewood, the hospital waiting room grew quieter, its fluorescent lights casting long shadows over the worn tile floor. Logan and Dylan sat curled together on the oversized couch, their small forms wrapped in a blanket provided by one of the nurses. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, but neither boy could sleep. Their mother's pale, fragile face haunted their thoughts. Officer Hayes sat across from them, his elbows resting on his knees. He had stayed long after his shift ended, unable to bring himself to leave the two young boys who had shown more bravery in one night than most people managed in a lifetime. He watched them in silence, his heart aching as memories of his own daughter surfaced. When a nurse finally approached, Hayes stood immediately, his shoulders tense. "How's the mother?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "She's stable," the nurse replied, her tone professional but warm. "The doctor's keeping her in observation, but we're confident she'll make a full recovery. It seems she had a severe asthma attack, complicated by the stress and the weather." Hayes let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him as he glanced back at the boys. "Can they see her?" The nurse hesitated, then nodded. "For a little while. She's still resting." Hayes knelt down in front of the twins, his voice gentle. "Hey, guys. The nurse says you can see your mom now." Both boys perked up instantly, their tired eyes widening. "Really?" Logan asked, hope flickering in his voice. "Really?" Hayes confirmed with a small smile. "Come on, I'll take you." The twins followed Hayes down the quiet hallway, their small footsteps echoing faintly against the walls. When they reached their mother's room, they hesitated in the doorway. Janelle lay propped up in bed, her complexion still pale but her breathing steady. Her eyes were closed, and an oxygen mask covered her face. "She's okay," the nurse assured them, gently nudging them forward. Logan and Dylan crept toward the bed, their movements tentative. As they reached her side, Janelle's eyes fluttered open. When she saw her boys, a weak but genuine smile spread across her face. "Mom!" Logan exclaimed, his voice breaking as he climbed onto the edge of the bed. Dylan followed, wrapping his arms around her carefully, as though afraid she might break. "My brave boys," Janelle whispered, her voice muffled by the mask. Tears glistened in her eyes as she stroked their hair. "You saved me." "We didn't know what else to do," Dylan murmured, his face buried in her shoulder. "The phones weren't working, and we were so scared." Janelle kissed the top of his head, her voice soft but firm. "You did exactly what you needed to do. I'm so proud of you both." Logan pulled back slightly, his expression a mixture of relief and guilt. "But we broke the rules. We drove Dad's car." Janelle cupped his cheek, her touch gentle. "Sometimes you have to bend the rules to do what's right. What matters is that you were brave, and you took care of each other. That's what makes you heroes." As the morning sun climbed higher, David Rivers arrived at the hospital, his face pale with worry. Hayes met him in the lobby, stepping forward to explain what had happened. "They're okay," Hayes began, holding up a hand to stop David's flood of questions. "Your wife's stable and the boys are with her now, but I need you to know something. They drove your car here to save her." David's eyes widened in shock. "They drove? They're just kids." "They're kids," Hayes agreed, his tone calm, "but they're also the reason your wife's alive. If they hadn't acted when they did, this might have ended differently." David stared at Hayes, his emotions warring between disbelief and gratitude. Finally, he ran a hand through his hair and let out a shaky breath. "Where are they?" "I'll take you to them," Hayes said, gesturing for David to follow. When David entered the room, he found Janelle awake, with Logan and Dylan tucked against her sides. The sight of his family safe and together brought tears to his eyes. "Dad!" Logan and Dylan leapt off the bed and ran to him, wrapping their arms around his waist. "We're sorry, Dad," Logan said, his voice muffled against David's shirt. "We didn't mean to scare you." David crouched down, hugging them tightly. "You scared me, all right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you also saved your mom. I couldn't be prouder of you two." Over the next few days, as Janelle recovered, the story of the twins' bravery spread throughout Littlewood. Neighbors stopped by the hospital with well wishes, and the local newspaper even ran a story about the boys' heroic act. For Logan and Dylan, the attention was overwhelming. They didn't feel like heroes, They had only done what they thought was right. But as their parents reminded them, true heroism often comes from ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of fear. Officer Hayes visited often, bringing small treats for the boys and checking in on Janelle. On his final visit, he brought a special gift, a framed certificate he had made himself, declaring Logan and Dylan honorary junior officers. The boys beamed with pride as they accepted the certificate, their smiles finally returning to their faces. It wasn't for a birthday or a holiday, but simply for life, for the love that had carried them through the darkest of nights. As they sat around the table, Janelle raised a glass of lemonade, her smile radiant. "To my boys," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You didn't just save me that night, you saved this family." Logan and Dylan exchanged shy smiles, their cheeks flushing with pride. "We just did what we had to," Logan said quietly. Janelle reached across the table, taking their hands in hers. "And that's what makes you heroes." In the end, the storm that had threatened to tear their family apart had only brought them closer together. And as they sat beneath the clear blue sky, the Rivers family knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger, braver, and more united than ever. The hospital administrator stopped just a few feet from Officer Brady, her sharp gaze moving from the bedraggled officer to the frightened twins clinging to each other. Her professional demeanor softened slightly as she took in the boys' tear-streaked faces. "Officer Brady?" she asked, her tone clipped but not unkind. Brady straightened, nodding. "Yes, ma'am. The boy's mother is being treated now. Severe respiratory distress. We had no time to wait for an ambulance." The administrator's expression flickered with concern. "I understand, officer, but bringing 2 minors through that storm in a police cruiser is highly irregular." Brady's jaw tightened, his patience worn thin. "With respect, ma'am, there wasn't any other choice. The roads were blocked, emergency services were delayed, and their mother needed immediate medical attention. Those boys saved her life tonight, and I wasn't going to let them down." The woman held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Understood," she said quietly. "Let me know if you or the children need anything. I'll ensure their mother receives the best care." She turned and walked briskly down the corridor, her heels echoing in the quiet space. Brady sighed, scrubbing a hand down his face. Exhaustion pressed heavily on him, but he refused to let it show in front of the boys. He crouched in front of them, his voice gentle. "How are you holding up?" Caleb looked at him, his face pale but determined. "Is Mom going to be okay?" Brady hesitated, his own fears pressing at the edges of his thoughts. "She's in the best possible place right now. The doctors are doing everything they can." Cameron sniffled, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. "I just want her to wake up," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You'll see her soon," Brady assured him. "And when you do, you can tell her how brave you both were tonight." The waiting room doors swung open suddenly, and a man burst in, his clothes soaked and his face a mask of fear. David Rivers looked around wildly until his eyes landed on his sons. "Caleb! Cameron!" The twins sprang from their seats, running to their father. "Dad!" they cried in unison, throwing their arms around him. David knelt, holding them tightly. "Are you okay? Where's your mom?" His voice cracked as he looked between them, his hands trembling as they clutched his son's shoulders. "Mom's with the doctors," Caleb explained, his words tumbling out. "She couldn't breathe and we couldn't call anyone, so we drove her here." David's breath hitched as he pulled them even closer. "You drove? How ... He trailed off, his eyes brimming with tears. "You saved her?" "We had to," Cameron whispered, his voice trembling. "She needed us." David looked up at Brady, his face a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You brought them here?" Brady nodded. "Your boys did most of the work, sir. I just stepped in to make sure they got here safely." David rose, his grip on his son's firm as he extended his free hand to Brady. "Thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Brady shook his hand firmly. "Just take care of your family. That's what matters." Hours passed, each one dragging painfully as the Rivers family waited for news. Caleb and Cameron dozed fitfully in their father's lap, their small bodies finally giving in to exhaustion. Brady sat nearby, his thoughts drifting to his daughter, Emily. He stared at his hands, remembering the night he'd cradled her in his arms, praying for a miracle that never came. Tonight had felt like a chance at redemption, a way to save someone else's child even if he couldn't save his own. The thought brought a lump to his throat, but he swallowed it down, focusing on the present. The sound of footsteps drew his attention. A doctor emerged from the emergency room, her expression calm but serious. "Mr. Rivers?" David stood quickly, his sons stirring against him. "That's me. How's my wife? Is she okay?" The doctor smiled faintly. "She's stable now. The asthma attack caused her oxygen levels to drop dangerously low, but we've managed to get her breathing under control. She's awake and asking for you." Relief swept through David, and he exhaled shakily. "Can we see her?" "Of course," the doctor said. She glanced at Brady and added, "And thank you, officer, for getting her here in time." Brady nodded, his chest loosening for the first time that night. "Just doing my job." The boys practically dragged their father down the hall to their mother's room. When they entered, Janelle's face lit up despite her exhaustion. She reached out weakly, and her sons rushed to her side, hugging her gently. "My boys," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with emotion. "You're my heroes." Caleb wiped at his eyes, sniffling. "We thought we were too late." "You were right on time," Janelle assured him, pulling him closer. "I'm so proud of you both." David knelt beside her, his hand wrapping around hers. "You scared us half to death," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you're okay now. That's all that matters." Janelle smiled faintly, her eyes brimming with tears. "We're okay because of our boys. They're braver than I ever knew." Brady watched from the doorway, his heart full as he witnessed the family's reunion. For the first time in years, the weight of his past felt a little lighter. He had kept his promise, to himself, to Emily, and to the Rivers family. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the hospital windows, the storm finally broke, leaving the streets glistening with rainwater. The Rivers family prepared to head home, their gratitude for each other stronger than ever. Before they left, Caleb and Cameron ran to Brady, who stood near his cruiser, ready to head back to the station. "Thank you, Officer Brady," Caleb said, his small hand extending toward the officer. Brady crouched to their level, shaking Caleb's hand firmly. "You don't need to thank me. You two were the real heroes tonight." Cameron grinned shyly. "Does this mean we can be police officers when we grow up?" Brady chuckled, ruffling his hair. "You'd make great officers. Just remember, being a hero isn't about wearing a badge. It's about doing what's right, no matter how scared you are." As the Rivers family drove away, Brady stood by his cruiser, watching them disappear down the road. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered, a reminder of the strength of love, the courage of children, and the healing power of second chances. And in his heart, Brady knew Emily would have been proud. Back at the Rivers' suburban home, the family's quiet return was marked by the warmth of familiarity. The house felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the previous night. David carried Janelle inside, her fragile form bundled in blankets as Caleb and Cameron hovered protectively at her side. "You need to rest," David said firmly, helping her settle onto the couch. His voice carried an unspoken plea for her to take things slow, as if her recovery depended as much on her willingness as the doctor's orders. "I'm okay," Janelle insisted, though her voice was still weak. She reached out to pat her sons on their heads, her smile soft but filled with gratitude. "Thanks to you two." Cameron sat beside her, holding her hand as though afraid to let go. "We were so scared, Mom," he admitted quietly. "We thought we'd lose you." "You didn't," she whispered, brushing his hair back, "because you were brave when I couldn't be. I'll never forget what you did." David sat across from them, his eyes heavy with unspoken emotions. "We owe Officer Brady, too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to call the station later to thank him again." Caleb frowned, glancing at his father. "Dad, he looked so sad last night. Like he was remembering something really bad." David nodded, his expression somber. "He's been through his own storms, son. Sometimes helping someone else is the best way to heal your own wounds." The next evening, as the family sat in their living room, the doorbell rang. David opened the door to find Officer Brady standing on the porch, dressed in plain clothes and holding a box of pastries from the local bakery. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Brady said, his smile warm but hesitant. "Not at all," David replied, stepping aside. "Come on in. The boys will be thrilled to see you." As soon as Brady entered, Caleb and Cameron rushed to greet him. "Officer Brady!" they cried in unison, their faces lighting up. "Hey there, partners," Brady said with a grin, crouching to their level. "How's your mom doing?" "She's better," Caleb answered. "She's resting upstairs." "Good to hear," Brady said, relief softening his features. "I brought something for you guys. Thought you might like a little treat after last night." The boys eagerly peeked into the box, their smiles widening at the sight of chocolate-covered pastries. "Thank you," Cameron exclaimed, bouncing on his toes. David gestured toward the couch. "Stay for coffee?" Brady hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure, I'd like that." As the adults settled in, the boys remained close, their eyes fixed on Brady as though he were a superhero in civilian disguise. "Officer Brady," Caleb began tentatively, "last night you said you had a daughter." The question hung in the air, and David began to intervene, but Brady raised a hand, signaling it was okay. "Yeah," Brady said softly. "Her name was Emily. She was about your age when she passed away." The boys' faces fell and Caleb's brow furrowed. "Was she sick?" Brady nodded, his gaze distant. "She had a condition called cystic fibrosis. It made it hard for her to breathe, like your mom last night. She fought so hard, but—" He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "One night she needed to get to the hospital fast, and I couldn't get her there in time." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. "I made a promise to myself after that," Brady continued, his voice steadier now. "If I ever had the chance to help someone like Emily, I wouldn't let anything stop me. Last night, that chance came, and I couldn't let it slip away." Caleb and Cameron exchanged a look before Caleb spoke. "We think Emily would be really proud of you." Brady's eyes glistened, and he smiled faintly. "Thank you, Caleb. That means a lot." Word of the twins' bravery spread quickly in Littlewood, and before long, the Rivers family received an invitation to a town meeting at the community center. The letter hinted at a special recognition for Caleb and Cameron, but the details were vague. When they arrived, the room was packed with neighbors, local officials, and even reporters. A large banner hung at the front of the room, emblazoned with the words, "Celebrating Local Heroes." The mayor stepped up to the podium, a warm smile on her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "tonight we honor two extraordinary young men whose quick thinking and courage saved a life." Caleb and Cameron fidgeted nervously as they were called to the front. The crowd erupted into applause, and their cheeks turned red as they stood side by side, holding hands for reassurance. The mayor continued, "In recognition of their bravery, the town of Littlewood proudly awards Caleb and Cameron Rivers the Medal of Community Valor." As the medals were placed around their necks, the crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation. Caleb glanced at his mother, who was beaming with pride, and then at Officer Brady, who gave him a small, encouraging nod from the audience. After the ceremony, Brady approached the boys. "How does it feel to be heroes?" he asked with a grin. "It feels weird," Caleb admitted. "We just did what we thought we had to do." "That's what makes you heroes," Brady said. "It's not about medals or ceremonies. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." As life in Littlewood settled back into its usual rhythm, the Rivers family made a point to keep in touch with Officer Brady. He became a regular visitor, sharing meals with them and even teaching the boys a few tricks of the trade, like how to properly call for help in an emergency. For Brady, The connection with the Rivers family brought a sense of healing he hadn't thought possible. Their warmth and gratitude reminded him that his daughter's memory could live on through acts of kindness and service. On a sunny afternoon, Caleb and Cameron invited Brady to the park, where they presented him with a handmade card. Inside, they had drawn a picture of their family with Brady included. "You're part of our family now," Caleb explained. Brady's voice caught in his throat as he replied, "That's the greatest honor I could ever have." The card found a permanent spot on Brady's mantle next to a photo of Emily. It served as a reminder that love and courage could light even the darkest of nights, creating connections that last a lifetime. Months later, the storm that had once seemed so devastating had become a story of resilience for the Rivers family. Janelle fully recovered, David spent more time with his boys, and Caleb and Cameron carried the lessons of that night with them into everything they did. For Officer Brady, the storm was more than a moment in his career. It was a turning point. It reminded him of the power of second chances and the importance of never giving up, no matter how dire the situation seemed. The bonds formed that night in the rain continued to grow, proving that even the heaviest storms can lead to the brightest skies. And in Littlewood, the story of two brave boys, their resilient mother, and the officer who stood by them became a cherished memory, a testament to the strength of love and the enduring power of hope. The events of that stormy night left ripples throughout Littlewood. For weeks, it seemed everyone in town had heard some version of the story, how two young boys had braved the odds to save their mother, aided by a police officer who refused to let history repeat itself. The story took on a life of its own, spreading through local papers, neighborhood meetings, and even school assemblies. Caleb and Cameron were now minor celebrities at their elementary school, their classmates bombarding them with questions. "Did you really drive the car?" one boy asked, wide-eyed. "How fast were you going?" Another chimed in, his voice filled with awe. Caleb, shy under the attention, kept his answers simple. "We just did what we had to do," he'd reply, shrugging awkwardly. Cameron, however, leaned into the spotlight, regaling his classmates with dramatic retellings. "And then the car started sliding on the bridge, and I thought we were going to fall off," he exclaimed, waving his arms for emphasis. Their teacher, Mrs. Hopkins, smiled as she listened to the chatter. During recess, she pulled the twins aside. "You know, you two showed incredible courage," she said. "But it wasn't just bravery. It was love that drove you to do what you did. That's what makes your story so special." The boys nodded, her words sinking in. For all the excitement their actions had stirred, they knew the real hero was their mom, their reason for fighting so hard. For Officer Brady, life didn't slow down after the storm. He returned to his regular duties, but something inside him had shifted. The connection he'd forged with the Rivers family had awakened a part of him he thought he'd lost, a sense of purpose beyond the badge. In the quiet moments between calls, his thoughts often drifted to Emily. He'd pull out the small locket he carried, a keepsake with her picture inside. "You'd have liked them, kiddo," he murmured one evening, gazing at her smiling face. "They remind me of you, so brave, so kind." Brady began volunteering more at the local youth center, offering mentorship to kids who needed a steady hand. It felt like a way to honor Emily's memory, to channel his pain into something positive. One evening, while reviewing his shift log, he came across a note from his captain. It read, "Stop by my office. We need to talk about that stunt you pulled on the bridge." Brady sighed, shaking his head. He knew there would be repercussions for his unorthodox actions that night. When he entered the captain's office the next morning, he was prepared for a reprimand. Instead, he was met with a grin. "You scared the hell out of us, Brady," the captain said, leaning back in his chair. "But you saved a life. I can't fault you for that. Just maybe warn us next time you decide to risk everything, okay?" Brady chuckled, relief washing over him. "Understood, sir." The Rivers family decided to hold a small gathering at their home to thank everyone who had supported them during Janelle's recovery. Neighbors, friends, and even some of the hospital staff attended, filling the house with laughter and warmth. Brady arrived late, carrying a tray of cookies from the town's bakery. He was greeted by Caleb and Cameron, who immediately dragged him to the backyard. "You have to see this," Caleb exclaimed, pointing to a new addition to the yard, a young oak tree planted near the fence. A small plaque at its base read, "In gratitude for second chances." "We planted it for Mom," Cameron explained, "and for you." Brady's throat tightened as he read the inscription. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Janelle approached, her steps slower but steady. "We wanted something to remind us of that night," she said, "something that could grow with us like the lessons we learned." Brady nodded, his hand resting on the boy's shoulders. "It's perfect." Months later, Brady received an invitation to speak at a state police conference. The topic was unconventional decision-making in high-pressure situations. Though public speaking wasn't his forte, he accepted, seeing it as an opportunity to share the lessons he'd learned. Standing at the podium, he recounted the events of the storm with clarity and emotion. "I wasn't just fighting to save a life that night," he told the audience. "I was fighting to honor a promise I made to myself, to never let fear or hesitation keep me from doing what's right." His story resonated deeply, earning him a standing ovation. Afterward, several officers approached him, sharing their own experiences of loss and redemption. It became clear to Brady that his story, and the Rivers family's courage, had the power to inspire others. He began speaking at schools, community centers, and police academies, spreading a message of hope and resilience. Years passed, and the Rivers family flourished. Caleb and Cameron grew into confident young men, their bond unshakable. Janelle often reflected on that stormy night, using it as a reminder to cherish every moment with her family. On a sunny afternoon, she sat on the porch flipping through a photo album. One picture stood out, a snapshot of Caleb and Cameron grinning with Officer Brady at the town meeting where they'd received their medals. "Mom, look," Cameron called from the yard. Janelle looked up to see Caleb waving at her from under the now fully grown oak tree. Its branches stretched toward the sky, strong and unyielding, just like her boys. Brady visited often, his presence a comforting constant in their lives. On one such visit, he brought a surprise, a framed newspaper article about their story, titled, "Heroes in the Storm." "We wanted you to have this," he said, handing it to Janelle. She smiled, her eyes misty. "Thank you, Brady, for everything." As the sun set over Littlewood, the Rivers family and Officer Brady sat together under the oak tree, sharing stories and laughter. The storm that had once seemed so insurmountable had given way to a bond that would last a lifetime, a testament to the power of love, courage, and second chances. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of his heart, Brady felt Emily's presence, her spirit shining through the family he'd come to love. Janelle watched from the window as sunlight bathed the backyard in warm hues, her heart swelling as she saw David and the boys working together in the garage. Caleb held a wrench, his small hands mimicking David's movements, while Cameron leaned in to inspect the engine with the same intensity his father used when solving a problem. The sight felt like a promise. Janelle had spent the past few days reflecting on everything that had happened. Her family had faced the storm, literally and figuratively, and emerged stronger. She felt gratitude for her boys, whose quick thinking had saved her, and for David, who now seemed determined to rebuild his relationship with his sons. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She moved slowly, still regaining her strength, and opened the door to find Officer Brady standing there, holding a small potted plant. "Morning, Mrs. Rivers," Brady said with a sheepish smile. "I thought this might brighten your day." Janelle stepped aside, inviting him in. "Come on in, officer. You didn't have to bring anything." Brady shrugged. "Well, I figured after everything, a little greenery couldn't hurt. It's called a peace lily. Good for recovery, they say." She chuckled softly as he set the plant on the coffee table. "You've already done so much for my family. You're a part of our story now." Brady hesitated, a flicker of emotion crossing his face before he spoke. "Your family's courage is what made the difference, Mrs. Rivers. I just played a small part." Janelle placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. "You were there when we needed someone most. That means everything." Out in the garage, David placed the wrench down and looked at his sons with a rare seriousness. "You know," he began, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've spent so much time trying to fix cars that I forgot the most important thing I need to fix is in here." He tapped his chest. Caleb and Cameron exchanged puzzled glances. "I haven't been the dad you deserve," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you, that changes now." Cameron stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "We don't want a different dad. We just want you to be here more." David knelt and pulled both boys into a tight hug. "I'll be here," he whispered, "every chance I get." The following week, the Rivers family received another invitation, this time to the school's annual assembly. Caleb and Cameron had been chosen as the week's role models, and their principal wanted to recognize their bravery in front of their peers. The gymnasium buzzed with chatter as parents and students filled the bleachers. Janelle sat beside David, her smile bright as the twins stood nervously near the stage. Officer Brady sat quietly in the back row, his presence unnoticed by most, but not by the Rivers family. When the principal called Caleb and Cameron to the stage, the applause was deafening. The boys shuffled forward, their cheeks red, as the principal recounted their heroic actions during the storm. "Young men, your bravery and quick thinking saved your mother's life," she said, her voice full of pride. "You are an inspiration to all of us." The boys were handed certificates, their names printed in bold letters above the words, "Exceptional Courage Award." The crowd erupted into cheers as Caleb and Cameron grinned shyly, waving to their classmates. From the back row, Brady clapped softly, a small smile on his face. Later that evening, Brady sat in his quiet apartment, staring at a framed photo of his daughter, Emily. The events of the past weeks had stirred something deep within him, a desire to do more, to reach out to children who needed guidance and protection. The next day, he walked into his precinct and requested to transfer to the department's Youth Outreach Division. His captain raised an eyebrow. "Youth Outreach? That's a big shift, Brady." "I've been thinking a lot lately," Brady replied. "Mom, look," Cameron called from the yard. Janelle looked up to see Caleb waving at her from under the now fully grown oak tree. Its branches stretched toward the sky, strong and unyielding, just like her boys. Brady visited often, his presence a comforting constant in their lives. On one such visit, he brought a surprise, a framed newspaper article about their story, titled, "Heroes in the Storm." "We wanted you to Sometimes the best way to prevent tragedy is to get involved early. These kids need someone to show them they're of this," he said, handing it to Janelle. She smiled, her eyes misty. "Thank you, Brady, for everything." As the sun set over Littlewood, the Rivers family and Officer Brady sat together under the oak tree, sharing stories and laughter. The storm that had once seemed so insurmountable had given way to a bond that would last a lifetime, a testament to the power of love, courage, and second chances. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of his heart, Brady felt Emily's presence, her spirit shining through the family he'd come to love. Janelle watched from the window as sunlight bathed the backyard in warm hues, her heart swelling as she saw David and the boys working together in the garage. Caleb held a wrench, his small hands mimicking David's movements, while Cameron leaned in to inspect the engine with the same intensity his father used when solving a problem. The sight felt like a promise. Janelle had spent the past few days reflecting on everything that had happened. Her family had faced the storm, literally and figuratively, and emerged stronger. She felt gratitude for her boys, whose quick thinking had saved her, and for David, who now seemed determined to rebuild his relationship with his sons. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She moved slowly, still regaining her strength, and opened the door to find Officer Brady standing there, holding a small potted plant. "Morning, Mrs. Rivers," Brady said with a sheepish smile. "I thought this might brighten your day." Janelle stepped aside, inviting him in. "Come on in, officer, you didn't have to bring anything." Brady shrugged. "Well, I figured after everything, a little greenery couldn't hurt. It's called a peace lily. Good for recovery, they say." She chuckled softly as he set the plant on the coffee table. "You've already done so much for my family. You're a part of our story now." Brady hesitated, a flicker of emotion crossing his face before he spoke. "Your family's courage is what made the difference, Mrs. Rivers. I just played a small part." Janelle placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. "You were there when we needed someone most. That means everything." Out in the garage, David placed the wrench down and looked at his sons with a rare seriousness. "You know," he began, wiping his hands on a rag, "I've spent so much time trying to fix cars that I forgot the most important thing I need to fix is in here." He tapped his chest. Caleb and Cameron exchanged puzzled glances. "I haven't been the dad you deserve?" David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you, that changes now." Cameron stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "We don't want a different dad. We just want you to be here more." David knelt and pulled both boys into a tight hug. "I'll be here," he whispered, "every chance I get." The following week, the Rivers family received another invitation, this time to the school's annual assembly. Caleb and Cameron had been chosen as the week's role models, and their principal wanted to recognize their bravery in front of their peers. The gymnasium buzzed with chatter as parents and students filled the bleachers. Janelle sat beside David, her smile bright as the twins stood nervously near the stage. Officer Brady sat quietly in the back row, his presence unnoticed by most but not by the Rivers family. When the principal called Caleb and Cameron to the stage, the applause was deafening. The boys shuffled forward, their cheeks red, as the principal recounted their heroic actions during the storm. "Young men, your bravery and quick thinking saved your mother's life," she said, her voice full of pride. "You are an inspiration to all of us." The boys were handed certificates, their names printed in bold letters above the words, "Exceptional Courage Award." The crowd erupted into cheers as Caleb and Cameron grinned shyly, waving to their classmates. From the back row, Brady clapped softly, a small smile on his face. Later that evening, Brady sat in his quiet apartment, staring at a framed photo of his daughter, Emily. The events of the past weeks had stirred something deep within him, a desire to do more, to reach out to children who needed guidance and protection. The next day, he walked into his precinct and requested to transfer to the department's Youth Outreach Division. His captain raised an eyebrow. "Youth Outreach? That's a big shift, Brady." "I've been thinking a lot lately," Brady replied. "Sometimes the best way to prevent tragedy is to get involved early. These kids need someone to show them there's another way." The captain studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, Brady, let's make it happen." Over the following months, Brady's presence in Littlewood grew beyond his role as a police officer. He organized workshops at the local community center, teaching kids practical skills like first aid and emergency preparedness. Caleb and Cameron became regular attendees, often helping Brady demonstrate techniques to other children. Janelle and David watched with pride as their boys blossomed under Brady's mentorship. The bond between them had deepened into something more than a connection forged in crisis. It was a friendship, a partnership in building a better future for Littlewood's youth. One day, Caleb approached Brady after a workshop. "Officer Brady," he said, his voice hesitant, "do you think I could grow up to be a police officer like you?" Brady smiled, crouching to Caleb's level. "Kid, you've already got what it takes. You're brave, smart, and you care about people. That's what makes a great officer." Cameron piped up, his eyes bright. "What about me?" "You too," Brady replied, ruffling his hair. "The world could use more kids like you two." Years later, on a warm spring day, Caleb and Cameron stood in front of a crowd at their high school graduation. They had grown into confident young men, their bond as strong as ever. In their valedictory speech, they shared the story of the storm that had changed their lives. "That night, we learned what it means to be brave," Caleb said, his voice steady. "And we learned that heroes come in all forms. Sometimes they're your family, and sometimes they're people like Officer Brady, who show up when you need them most." Brady, now retired from the force, sat in the audience with Janelle and David, his chest swelling with pride. As the ceremony ended, the twins made their way through the crowd to Brady, each extending a hand. "We wouldn't be here without you," Caleb said. Brady shook their hands, his smile tinged with emotion. "No, boys. You made it here because of your strength and your love for each other. I just gave you a little push." The storm that had once brought fear and chaos to the Rivers family had become a cornerstone of their story, a reminder of their resilience and the bonds that held them together. And for Officer Brady, the storm had been a turning point. It had given him a chance to heal, to honor Emily's memory, and to make a lasting impact on the lives of others. Together, they proved that even in the darkest moments, love, courage, and hope could light the way forward. The Rivers family found ways to mark the storm that had redefined their lives, seeing it not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of what they had endured together. The oak tree planted in their backyard became a central symbol of resilience. Over time, its branches grew thick and strong, a reflection of the family's bond. Janelle often sat beneath the tree, watching Caleb and Cameron play. On particularly quiet afternoons, she would close her eyes and rest her hand on the rough bark, feeling a connection to the life the tree represented. "This tree reminds me of you two," she said one day as the boys sat beside her. Strong, determined, and unbreakable, even in the worst storm. David began spending more time at home, closing the garage earlier to be there for family dinners and weekend outings. One Saturday, he surprised the boys with a project, building a treehouse in the oak. "It's about time this tree had some company," David said, his grin infectious. The treehouse became a sanctuary for the boys, a place where they laughed, dreamed, and recounted the night of the storm with a mix of awe and pride. They hung a sign at the entrance that read, "The Safe Haven." Officer Brady's transition to youth outreach opened a new chapter in his career. Working directly with families and children in Littlewood, he found himself more fulfilled than he had been in years. He hosted events at schools, led community workshops, and organized programs that empowered kids to face challenges with courage and resourcefulness. One afternoon, Brady visited Caleb and Cameron's school for a safety demonstration. The boys helped him set up cones, demonstrate first aid, and teach their classmates about responding to emergencies. "Remember," Brady said, addressing the group of eager students, "being a hero doesn't mean you're fearless, it means you act even when you're scared." Caleb and Cameron exchanged knowing smiles. During a quiet moment after the event, Janelle approached Brady with a thermos of coffee. "You've made a huge difference for this community," she said, her gratitude evident. Brady took the coffee, his smile warm but modest. "It's your boys who inspire me. They remind me that even in tough times, we can choose to rise above." David's transformation wasn't immediate, but it was steady. He began including Caleb and Cameron in his work at the garage, teaching them skills he had once taken for granted. "Every engine has a story," he told them one day as they worked together. "And every family does too. Ours is just getting started." Caleb loved working on cars, his hands often streaked with grease by the end of the day. Cameron preferred creating sketches of the cars they worked on, his imagination adding fantastical designs to real models. One evening, David brought home an old beat-up go-kart. "This is our next project," he said, grinning. Together, they restored the cart, painting it bright red and adding decals. The project became a bonding experience, and when it was finished, the three of them took turns racing it around the neighborhood. Months after the storm, the Rivers family decided to hold a community gathering to thank everyone who had supported them. Neighbors, hospital staff, and even local officials filled their backyard, sharing stories and laughter. Brady arrived late, carrying a box of donuts from a popular bakery. "I couldn't come empty-handed," he joked, handing the box to Caleb. During the gathering, David tapped a glass with a fork, drawing everyone's attention. "I want to say something," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "This family has been through a lot, but we wouldn't be here without all of you." He glanced at Janelle, who smiled encouragingly. "And to Officer Brady," David continued, turning toward him. "You didn't just save my family that night. You reminded me what it means to show up when it matters most. Thank you. The crowd erupted in applause as Brady nodded humbly. For Officer Brady, the Rivers family's resilience helped him come to terms with his own loss. Inspired by their strength, he decided to honor Emily's memory in a tangible way. With the help of local donors and community leaders, Brady spearheaded the creation of a memorial garden at Littlewood's Community Center. At its heart stood a bronze plaque inscribed with the words, "In honor of Emily Brady and all the lives we strive to protect." At the garden's dedication, Brady spoke to the crowd, his voice steady despite the emotion in his words. This garden isn't just about remembering Emily. It's about reminding all of us that even in the face of loss, we can find ways to create something beautiful. Caleb and Cameron stood in the front row, their faces solemn as they listened. Later, they placed flowers at the base of the plaque, a quiet gesture of respect for the girl whose memory had inspired their hero. As the years went by, Caleb and Cameron continued to carry the lessons of the storm with them. Their bond remained unbreakable, and their shared experiences gave them a perspective on life that many their age lacked. On their 16th birthday, David handed them the keys to the family's restored Chevy Impala, the same car they had driven through the storm. "This car is part of your story now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The twins took turns driving the car, their laughter filling the air as they navigated Littlewood's familiar streets. To them, the Impala wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of courage, love, and the night they'd become heroes. By the time Brady retired, his work in youth outreach had left an indelible mark on Littlewood. Programs he started continued to thrive, and his impact was felt by countless families. Caleb and Cameron, now young adults, decided to surprise Brady on his last day at the precinct. They arrived with a gift, a framed photo of the three of them from the night of the storm, along with a handwritten note. "Officer Brady, thank you for believing in us when we needed it most. You didn't just help us save our mom. You showed us what it means to protect and serve. We hope to carry your lessons with us always. With gratitude, Caleb and Cameron Rivers." Brady's eyes glistened as he read the note. "You boys didn't need me to believe in you," he said, his voice full of pride. "You already had everything you needed. I just helped you see it." Years later, the Rivers family and Officer Brady gathered under the oak tree in the Rivers' backyard. The tree had grown tall and strong, its branches providing shade as they reminisced about the storm that had brought them together. "I still can't believe we drove that night," Caleb said with a laugh, shaking his head. Cameron grinned. "And I still can't believe Brady didn't yell at us for it." Brady chuckled, sipping his iced tea. "I think you two learned your lesson well enough without me adding to it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a golden glow, Janelle raised her glass. "To storms," she said, her voice steady, "for reminding us how strong we can be." They clinked glasses, their laughter and conversation filling the air as the oak tree stood tall, its roots deep and unshakable, just like the bonds they'd formed. Through the years, the story of the Rivers family and Officer Brady remained a cherished tale in Littlewood, a testament to love, courage, and the enduring power of second chances. The story of the Rivers family and Officer Brady left a lasting impression on Littlewood. It became a tale that parents told their children about the importance of bravery and quick thinking. At the annual town festival, a new tradition was born, honoring everyday heroes. Caleb and Cameron were asked to speak at the festival's inaugural event. Standing on the stage before a crowd of neighbors and friends, Caleb spoke first. "When the storm hit, we didn't feel like heroes," he began, his voice clear but tinged with emotion. "We were scared, and we didn't know what to do. But we remembered what our parents taught us, that family comes first and you fight for the people you love." Cameron stepped up beside him, adding, "And sometimes heroes don't wear capes or uniforms. They're just people who care enough to help, like Officer Brady, who stood by us when we needed him most." The crowd erupted into applause, and Brady, standing near the back, gave the boys a proud nod. The festival's theme that year became Acts of Courage, and families shared their own stories of resilience, creating a ripple effect of hope and community spirit. As they grew older, Caleb and Cameron began to chart their own paths, but their bond remained unbreakable. Caleb developed a passion for mechanics, following in David's footsteps. He started apprenticing at the garage during high school, learning every intricacy of engines and machinery. Cameron, on the other hand, channeled his creativity into art. His sketches of cars, landscapes, and even moments from the storm earned him a scholarship to a prestigious art school. Before leaving for college, he painted a mural on the wall of the garage, a sweeping depiction of the stormy night, the Impala cutting through the rain, and Officer Brady's cruiser close behind. "This is our story," Cameron told Caleb as they stood before the finished mural. "And it's a reminder that no matter where life takes us, we can weather any storm." Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just our story," he said. "It's Brady's too. It's everyone who helped us that night." Officer Brady's retirement ceremony was a bittersweet occasion. The precinct gathered to honor his years of service, but it was the unexpected arrival of the Rivers family that made the event truly memorable. Janelle, now fully recovered, spoke on behalf of her family. "Officer Brady didn't just save my life that night," she said, her voice steady. "He gave my boys the courage to believe in themselves, and he reminded my husband and me what family means. We're here today because of him." As she finished, Caleb and Cameron stepped forward with a gift, a custom shadow box containing Brady's badge, photos from their journey, and a small plaque that read, "To the man who taught us what it means to protect and serve." Brady, overwhelmed with emotion, accepted the gift with tears in his eyes. "You've all given me more than I could ever give back," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Years later, Caleb opened his own garage, calling it Second Chance Auto. The name was a nod to the night that changed everything and to the lessons Brady had instilled in him. Cameron, now a successful artist, designed the logo, a stylized image of the Impala under a stormy sky, with rays of sunlight breaking through. One afternoon, as Caleb worked on a customer's car, a familiar figure walked into the garage. It was Brady, carrying a box of donuts and wearing the same kind smile Caleb had known since he was a boy. "Still fixing cars, huh?" Brady teased, setting the donuts on a nearby workbench. "And still showing up with donuts," Caleb shot back, grinning. Brady's eyes fell on the mural Cameron had painted, now proudly displayed in the lobby of the garage. He took a moment to admire the details, the rain, the lights, the unmistakable look of determination on the painted version of himself. "You boys turned out all right," Brady said, his voice filled with pride. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, his smile softening. "We had a good role model." On the anniversary of the storm, the Rivers family and Brady gathered once more under the oak tree in their backyard. The tree, now towering and strong, had become a living symbol of their journey. David lit a small lantern, its warm glow flickering as the sun set. "To family," he said, raising the lantern toward the sky, "and to the people who stand with us in the storm." The group released lanterns into the evening air, their soft light floating upward like tiny stars. Caleb and Cameron watched in silence, their hearts full as they stood side by side. "You think we'll still do this when we're old?" Cameron asked with a grin. "Definitely," Caleb replied. "Some stories are worth retelling forever." Brady, seated nearby, gazed at the lanterns with a mixture of contentment and wistfulness. In his heart, he felt Emily's presence, as though she were watching from somewhere beyond the stars. And as the lanterns rose higher, the Rivers family and Brady knew that no matter how many years passed, the bonds forged in that storm would remain unbreakable, a testament to love, resilience, and the enduring power of second chances. Decades later, the oak tree still stood in the Rivers' backyard, its branches sheltering generations of laughter, love, and memories. Caleb and Cameron, now with families of their own, often brought their children to visit the treehouse, which had been lovingly maintained over the years. "This is where it all started," Caleb told his son one day, pointing to the oak's strong trunk. "And this is where we learned that even the biggest storms can't break us." Cameron, sketchbook in hand, smiled as he captured the scene. "It's not just about the storm," he said. "It's about how we came together because of it." Officer Brady's legacy lived on, not just in the hearts of the Rivers family, but in the programs he had started and the lives he had touched. His story became part of Littlewood's history, a shining example of how one person's actions could ripple outward, changing countless lives for the better. And as the oak tree stood tall against the winds of time, it served as a quiet reminder that love and courage could weather any storm, leaving behind roots deep enough to nurture generations to come. The morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of dew as the Rivers family began another day. Inside the kitchen, sunlight poured through the windows, casting golden beams across the countertops. Janelle moved with a quiet grace, flipping pancakes while humming a soft tune. She glanced at the calendar pinned to the refrigerator, noticing the date, the anniversary of the storm that had forever changed their lives. "Breakfast's ready," she called, her voice carrying through the house. Caleb and Cameron raced into the kitchen, their faces glowing with energy. "Mom, can we go to the garage after breakfast?" Caleb asked, grabbing a plate and piling it high with pancakes. "Yeah, Dad said he's going to show us how to fix a carburetor today," Cameron added, his voice tinged with excitement. Janelle smiled as she watched her sons dig into their food. "Just don't forget to save some for your dad," she teased. David appeared in the doorway, his work apron slung over one shoulder. "Don't worry, I've learned to grab mine first," he said with a grin, ruffling Caleb's hair as he passed. The family shared an easy laughter that filled the room, a sound that had become more frequent since that fateful night. After breakfast, Caleb and Cameron ran outside, eager to start their lesson in the garage. David was already at the workbench, laying out tools and explaining the basics of carburetors. "This part mixes fuel and air," he said, holding up a small, intricate component. "Without it, the engine doesn't run." The boys leaned in, their eyes wide with curiosity, asking questions as David patiently explained each piece. The rumble of a familiar engine interrupted their lesson. Caleb's head snapped up, his face breaking into a wide grin as a police cruiser pulled into the driveway. "It's Officer Brady!" Caleb shouted, dropping his wrench and sprinting toward the car. Cameron was right behind him, their enthusiasm contagious. Brady stepped out, a warm smile spreading across his face as he watched the boys approach. He wore his uniform today, though his demeanor was far from formal. "Morning, boys," he greeted, reaching into his car to retrieve a small bag. "I brought something for my favorite mechanics." The twins crowded around him as he pulled out 2 child-sized toolboxes, each engraved with their names. Caleb and Cameron's eyes lit up as they opened the lids, revealing neatly arranged miniature tools. "These are just for you," Brady said, his tone affectionate. "Every mechanic needs the right tools, and I figured you'd put these to good use." David walked over, a genuine smile on his face as he extended a hand to Brady. "You're spoiling them," he said, his tone warm. "Just giving them a head start," Brady replied, shaking David's hand firmly. As the morning stretched on, the boys dove into their garage lesson with renewed excitement, their new tools in hand. Caleb tightened bolts with precision while Cameron carefully cleaned components under David's guidance. Brady leaned against the garage door, watching the scene unfold. "They've got a knack for this," he remarked. David nodded, his pride evident. "They remind me of myself at their age, curious about how things work, eager to learn." He paused, glancing at Brady. "I never got to thank you properly for everything you did that night. You didn't just help us, you changed our lives." Brady's expression softened, and he looked down briefly before meeting David's gaze. "I didn't do it alone. Your boys have more courage than most adults I know. They were the real heroes." From the corner of the garage, Caleb called out, "Dad, Brady, look." "We fixed it." David and Brady turned to see Caleb and Cameron standing proudly beside the engine, their faces beaming with accomplishment. "Let's test it," David said, grabbing the keys. As he turned the ignition, the engine roared to life, eliciting cheers from the boys. Later that afternoon, the family gathered under the oak tree in the backyard. the same tree they'd planted after the storm. Its branches stretched wide, providing shade as they shared glasses of lemonade and reflected on the day. Brady sat on a folding chair, his uniform jacket draped over the back. He watched Caleb and Cameron race around the yard, their laughter echoing through the air. Janelle, seated beside him, leaned over. "You know, you're more than just an officer to them," she said softly. "You're part of this family now." Brady looked at her, his face a mix of gratitude and humility. "That means more to me than you know," he replied. Cameron ran up, holding the toy police car Brady had given them months ago. "We keep it on our nightstand," he said proudly. "It reminds us of you." Brady knelt, placing a hand on Cameron's shoulder. "You don't need a toy to remind you of me," he said gently, "because I'll always be here when you need me." That evening, the family gathered in the living room, the cozy space illuminated by the soft glow of a table lamp. Janelle sat beside David on the couch, while Caleb and Cameron sprawled on the floor with a scrapbook open between them. The pages were filled with photos, clippings, and drawings from their journey, the storm, the hospital, and the months of healing that followed. One page featured their medals from the school assembly, carefully glued beside a picture of Brady. "We've come a long way," Janelle said, her voice filled with emotion. David nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "And we've got more to look forward to." Caleb held up a drawing he'd been working on, a detailed sketch of their family standing under the oak tree, with Brady included. "I think we should put this in the garage," he said. Cameron grinned. "Right next to the mural." As the family laughed and reminisced, the weight of the storm felt distant, replaced by a sense of strength and unity. Outside, the oak tree swayed gently in the evening breeze, its branches whispering a quiet promise. No matter what storms may come, this family would weather them together. The seasons changed, and with them came new beginnings for the Rivers family. Spring brought bright green leaves to the oak tree in their backyard, and with it, a sense of renewal. Janelle had fully recovered, her strength returning in full as she began volunteering at the local community center. Caleb and Cameron thrived, their bond growing deeper with every passing day. The garage became their second home, a place where they worked alongside their father, learning the intricacies of engines and machines. "Someday this shop could be yours," David said one afternoon, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "If you want it." Caleb grinned, his face lighting up. "Really?" Cameron, more thoughtful, looked at the tools spread out on the workbench. "We could fix anything, couldn't we?" "Anything," David said with pride. Brady's role in the family didn't wane after the storm. If anything, it grew stronger. He became a constant presence in their lives, dropping by with donuts on weekends or helping the boys with school projects. One Saturday morning, he arrived with a surprise: a large book titled First Responder Stories. Inside were tales of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of bravery. "This," Brady said, handing the book to Caleb and Cameron, "is to remind you that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, just like you two." The boys flipped through the pages, their eyes wide with wonder as they read the stories. "Will we be in a book someday?" Cameron asked. Brady smiled. "You already are. Your story is just beginning." Months later, Brady invited the Rivers family to visit the police precinct. Caleb and Cameron could hardly contain their excitement as they walked through the bustling hallways, their eyes darting from desk to desk. "Welcome to where the magic happens," Brady said with a grin, leading them to his office. The boys marveled at the bulletin board covered with photos, maps, and case notes. One corner was dedicated to thank you notes and drawings from local children, a testament to the impact Brady had made in the community. "This is where I work," Brady explained, gesturing to his neatly organized desk. "But the real work happens out there, in the field." He handed each boy a small notebook. "Every officer carries one of these. It's where we write down things we notice, things that matter." Cameron opened his notebook immediately, scribbling a quick sketch of the precinct. Caleb, meanwhile, wrote a single word: family. On the anniversary of the storm, the Rivers family hosted a small gathering in their backyard. Friends, neighbors, and even some of the hospital staff who had cared for Janelle attended. The oak tree stood tall and proud, its branches decorated with twinkling lights. Underneath, a table displayed photos and mementos from the past year: medals, newspaper clippings, and a framed drawing of the family by Cameron. Brady arrived late, carrying a box of cupcakes decorated with tiny oak trees. "Thought these might fit the theme," he said, setting the box on the table. As the evening wore on, David stood to address the group. "A year ago, we didn't know if we'd make it through that storm," he began, his voice steady. "But here we are, stronger, closer, and more grateful than ever, and we couldn't have done it alone." He turned to Brady, his expression filled with emotion. "You were our light in the dark. Thank you for being there when we needed you most." The crowd applauded, and Brady nodded humbly. As time went on, Caleb and Cameron took the lessons they'd learned and applied them to everything they did. They became known in their community as reliable, kind-hearted kids who were always ready to lend a hand. At school, Caleb started a Fix-It Club, teaching classmates how to repair everything from bikes to broken furniture. Cameron joined the art club, using his talent to create murals that brightened their town. One mural, painted on the side of a local shop, depicted a stormy night with a car cutting through the rain. Above it were the words, "Bravery is love in action." Brady visited the mural one afternoon, his heart swelling with pride. The words were a perfect reflection of the journey they had all taken together. Years later, Brady announced his retirement. The Rivers family attended his farewell ceremony, sitting in the front row as the precinct honored his decades of service. When it was Brady's turn to speak, he addressed the crowd with a mix of humor and humility. But when he looked at the Rivers family, his voice grew serious. "Sometimes it's the people you help who end up helping you the most," he said, his eyes meeting Caleb and Cameron's. "This family reminded me why I put on this uniform every day. They gave me purpose when I needed it most." After the ceremony, Caleb and Cameron presented Brady with a gift: a leather-bound journal embossed with his initials. Inside were handwritten notes from the family, along with photos of their shared moments. Brady ran his hand over the cover, his voice thick with emotion. "This is more than I deserve," he said quietly. "It's exactly what you deserve," Janelle replied with a smile. As Caleb and Cameron grew into young men, they continued to carry the lessons of their childhood with them. Caleb took over the family garage, renaming it Brady and Sons Auto Repair, as a tribute to the man who had inspired him. Cameron pursued a career in art, creating works that celebrated resilience and community. His most famous piece, a sculpture of an oak tree with intertwining roots, was installed in Littlewood's town square. Brady visited the sculpture one sunny afternoon, running his hand over the smooth metal branches. Beside him stood Caleb and Cameron, now grown but still the same at heart. "You've both done amazing things," Brady said, his voice filled with pride. "Because of you," Caleb replied. "No," Brady said, shaking his head. "Because of who you are. I just helped you see it." Decades after the storm, the oak tree in the Rivers' backyard remained a symbol of their journey. Its roots ran deep, just like the bonds they had formed with each other and with Brady. On quiet evenings, the family gathered beneath its branches, sharing stories and laughter. They spoke of the storm not with fear, but with gratitude, for it had shown them the strength of their love and the power of second chances. And as the sun set, casting golden light across the tree's sturdy limbs, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because in the end, storms don't just test us, they shape us, leaving behind roots strong enough to weather anything. Years passed, and Littlewood became a town known for its resilience. The story of the Rivers family and Officer Brady continued to echo through the community. Their journey was a reminder of how even the fiercest storms could yield moments of profound transformation. Caleb, now in his 20s, ran Brady and Sons Auto Repair, with precision and heart. His reputation grew beyond Littlewood, as customers flocked to his shop not just for repairs, but for the honesty and care he poured into every job. Cameron, meanwhile, found himself balancing a successful career as an artist with his love for teaching. He opened a small studio downtown, offering free workshops to kids who wanted to explore their creativity. On the studio's front wall, he painted a mural of the oak tree in their backyard, its roots spreading out to cradle the words, "Strength grows here." One summer evening, the Rivers family hosted a barbecue under the oak tree. The yard was filled with the sounds of sizzling grills, clinking glasses, and joyful conversation. Neighbors and friends gathered, enjoying the easy camaraderie that had come to define the Rivers' home. Brady arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange. He carried a well-worn photo album under his arm and a smile on his face. "You're just in time," Janelle called from the patio, waving him over. Brady joined the group at the long wooden table, where Caleb and Cameron were already swapping stories with old friends. As the night wore on, the conversations turned reflective. "You've been with us through so much," Janelle said, her voice soft as she addressed Brady. "I can't imagine our lives without you." Brady glanced around the table, taking in the faces of the family he had grown to love as his own. "You've given me more than I ever expected," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. David raised his glass. "To Storms," he said, his words carrying a weight of gratitude, "for showing us what really matters." The table echoed his toast, the sound of clinking glasses mingling with the hum of cicadas in the night air. Brady's retirement didn't mean the end of his involvement in the community. He took on a mentorship role, working with young officers and sharing the lessons he had learned over the years. One afternoon, he invited Caleb and Cameron to join him at the precinct for a talk he was giving to a group of new recruits. The boys, now grown but still eager to learn from Brady, sat in the front row as he spoke. "Being a first responder isn't just about training or experience," Brady began. "It's about heart. It's about showing up for people when they need you most." He paused, his gaze falling on Caleb and Cameron. "Sometimes, the greatest acts of bravery come from those who don't wear a uniform, like these two, who taught me what it means to act with courage and love." After the talk, one of the young officers approached Caleb and Cameron. "You're the kids from the Storm story, right?" she asked, her voice tinged with awe. Cameron nodded, smiling. "Yeah, that's us." The officer grinned. "Hearing what you did, it's why I signed up to join the force, to make a difference like that." Brady watched the interaction with quiet pride, knowing the ripple effects of their story were still unfolding. As the years stretched into decades, the Rivers family continued to grow and thrive. Caleb married and had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who became regular fixtures in the garage. They loved tinkering with tools and listening to their grandfather David tell stories of the family's adventures. Cameron's art studio expanded, and his work was displayed in galleries across the country. But no matter where life took him, he always returned to Littlewood, where the oak tree stood as a reminder of his roots. Brady, now in his twilight years, spent most of his days gardening and reading. He often visited the Rivers' home, sitting under the oak tree with a cup of tea and sharing memories with Janelle and David. On one such visit, Caleb's son brought out the toy police car Brady had given his father all those years ago. The paint was chipped and the wheels wobbled, but it was still intact. "Look, Grandpa Brady," the boy exclaimed, holding up the car. "It's just like your real one." Brady chuckled, his eyes misty. "It sure is, kiddo, and it's still as special as ever." One crisp autumn morning, the Rivers family gathered for a ceremony in Littlewood's town square. A new addition to the park had been unveiled, a bronze statue of an oak tree, its branches reaching upward with strength and grace. At its base was a plaque that read, "In honor of those who weather the storm," a testament to courage, love, and the power of second chances. The family stood together, their hands intertwined as they read the inscription. Brady, though frail, was there too, leaning on a cane but standing tall with pride. "This isn't just about us," Janelle said, her voice steady. "It's about everyone who chooses to fight for what matters, no matter the odds." As they walked away from the statue, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the park. The oak tree in their backyard, visible from the distance, swayed gently in the breeze. In the years that followed, the story of the Rivers family and Officer Brady became a cherished part of Littlewood's history. It was told in classrooms, shared at community events, and passed down through generations. Caleb's children loved hearing their grandfather tell the tale, their eyes wide with wonder as he recounted the stormy night that had brought their family closer. "And that's when Brady showed up," Caleb would say, his voice filled with warmth. "He didn't just save us. He became part of our family." The children would look at the photo of Brady that hung in the garage, their young faces filled with admiration. When Brady passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87, the Rivers family honored his memory with a private ceremony under the oak tree. They shared stories, shed tears, and celebrated the life of a man who had given them so much. Caleb placed the toy police car at the base of the tree, its worn surface gleaming in the sunlight. "You'll always be with us," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. The oak tree, now towering and majestic, stood as a living testament to the strength of their bond. Its roots ran deep, just like the love and courage that had carried them through the storm. Years later, Caleb's daughter planted a sapling next to the oak tree, a symbol of the family's ongoing story. As she patted the soil around its base, she looked up at her father. "Do you think it'll grow as big as this one?" she asked, pointing to the towering oak. Caleb smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It will," he said, "because it's planted with love, just like this one was." And as the family gathered under the shade of the oak tree, sharing laughter and memories, they knew that the legacy of love, courage, and second chances would continue to grow, just like the roots beneath their feet.